On a cool September night in 1993, the quiet streets of North Tonawanda, New York, carried an unease that no one could yet put into words. For most, it was an ordinary weekend, the kind of night where teenagers stayed out late, parents trusted they'd come home, and the town itself seemed to rest easy under the streetlights. But before the sun rose again, one girl would disappear, and the silence of that night would echo through her community for nearly 30 years. 17-year-old Mandy Steingasser wasn't just another student at North Tonawanda High School. She was a daughter, a friend, a young woman with plans and promise. Those who knew her described her as vibrant, outgoing, and funny, the kind of girl who seemed to live fully in every moment. She was sharp and determined, already thinking about the future beyond graduation. To her family, she was simply Mandy, a teenager who could be both independent and caring, someone who could make you laugh one minute and surprise you with her insight the next. That weekend should have been unremarkable. Just another Saturday night in a small town where little seemed to change. But that's the cruel truth about cases like these. Tragedy rarely announces itself. Before we continue, welcome to the Cold Case Archive. Here we revisit stories long buried in dusty files and unmarked boxes. The mysteries that never stopped haunting families and investigators. We bring light to the cases that deserve to be remembered, and sometimes deserve to be solved. If you believe these stories matter, subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and share your thoughts in the comments. Together we keep these voices alive. On the night of September 18th, Mandy was out with friends. It was the start of her senior year, and like most teenagers, she was balancing school responsibilities with nights of laughter and freedom. North Tonawanda wasn't the kind of place where people constantly looked over their shoulders. Situated between Buffalo and Niagara Falls, it had the feel of a close-knit community. Neighbors waved at one another. Kids grew up together. Parents trusted that if their children weren't home, someone else's family was probably keeping an eye on them. But the early 90s were different from today. There were no cell phones to track someone's movements, no social media to leave behind a digital trail. When a teenager went missing, the absence was total. That night, Mandy eventually became separated from her friends. Exactly how remains unclear. Some accounts suggest the group had been hanging out at a local party, others say she drifted off from the people she'd been with. What's certain is that in the late hours after midnight, Mandy was walking along Oliver Street. It was quiet, nearly deserted, the kind of street where a teenager alone might be relieved to see someone familiar. And that's when she crossed paths with 21-year-old Joseph Belstadt. Belstadt wasn't a stranger. He was older, but he lived in the same community. Seeing him wasn't unusual, and when he pulled up in his 1984 Pontiac and offered her a ride, Mandy got in. To her, it may have seemed like the safest option. The streets were empty, it was late, and here was someone she recognized. In that moment, the decision must have felt like a relief. But it would be the last choice she ever made. Witnesses later confirmed seeing Mandy step into Belstadt's car. From that point forward, the timeline fractured. Belstadt would later insist he dropped her off safely. But Mandy never returned home. When morning came and Mandy still hadn't arrived, alarm bells rang immediately. Her family knew something was wrong. Mandy wasn't someone who disappeared without telling anyone. She wasn't reckless. And she certainly wasn't the type to leave her loved ones worrying without reason. Her parents began calling her friends, asking if anyone had seen her. Fear spread quickly as the hours passed with no word. By the time the police became involved, Mandy's disappearance already carried a weight of dread. Investigators retraced her steps as best they could. They learned she had last been seen with Belstadt. He admitted she was in his car that night but claimed he let her out. It was his word against the void of Mandy's absence. There was no physical evidence strong enough to hold him, no digital trail to verify his story. Flyers with Mandy's photo began circulating. Volunteers joined in the search. The Steingasser family lived in a haze of fear and exhaustion, clinging to the possibility that she would come walking back through the door. Each day was measured in phone calls that brought no news and nights of sleepless waiting. It's hard to overstate how much those first hours matter in a case like this. When a person goes missing, every second lost is a trail growing colder. Looking back, what do you think investigators should prioritize in those first 48 hours? Should they lock in immediately on the last person seen with the victim, or cast a wider net to explore possibilities beyond the obvious? Share your thoughts. Your hindsight might reflect the very choices detectives debated at the time. Meanwhile, Belstadt was already at the center of suspicion. Police seized his Pontiac, vacuuming it for fibers and hairs. But this was 1993. Forensic science was limited, and what they gathered couldn't yet provide the clarity investigators desperately needed. Suspicion alone wasn't enough to make an arrest. So Mandy's disappearance remained an open wound. For her family, the days stretched painfully. They replayed her last known steps over and over, wondering if there was some detail, some warning, something they had missed. Did she hesitate before getting into that car? Did she sense danger? Was there a moment she realized she was in trouble? Those questions had no answers, only torment. The community felt the weight of her absence too. Parents held their children a little closer. Curfews grew stricter. Conversations that once revolved around school events and neighborhood news now circled around one terrifying reality. If Mandy could vanish, it could happen to anyone. The town buzzed with speculation, whispers that never seemed to fade. And yet, no matter how much people talked, no matter how much they searched, Mandy did not come home. The hope her family held on to, that maybe she was hiding, maybe she had run away, maybe there was some explanation that would bring her back safe, began to wither. Because weeks were passing. And with each sunrise, the possibility of finding her alive grew dimmer. It would take more than a month before the community got the answers they dreaded. And when they came, they would not be the resolution anyone had prayed for. For the Steingasser family, the first days after Mandy's disappearance were unbearable. They lived in a state of suspended reality, where the ordinary rhythms of life stopped cold, replaced by phone calls, door knocks, and desperate prayers. Each passing hour without news deepened their fear, until the days blurred together in a haze of dread and exhaustion. The search for Mandy began in earnest almost immediately. Friends, neighbors, and volunteers poured in to help. They combed the neighborhood she was known to frequent, pinned flyers with her picture to bulletin boards and shop fronts, and spread the word in schools, parks, and malls. Her face stared back from utility poles, alongside the word that no parent ever wants to see: missing. The family refused to let hope slip away. Her parents spoke to the press, reminding the public that Mandy was not a runaway, she was a bright, lively girl who was deeply connected to her family. They urged anyone with even the smallest detail to come forward. In the fall of 1993, the community responded the way small towns often do in times of crisis. People who didn't know the Steingassers showed up anyway, to knock on doors, to join ground searches, to hand out flyers. Some drove hours just to help post missing person posters. The sense of urgency was palpable. Yet, with each day that passed without answers, optimism gave way to dread. Police worked to piece together a timeline. They learned Mandy had last been seen with Joseph Belstadt, a 21-year-old family acquaintance. He admitted giving her a ride home that night but insisted he dropped her off safely. The problem was no one else saw her after that. No witnesses could confirm she made it home. No neighbor saw her walk into her house. The last person known to be with Mandy was Joseph, and beyond his word, investigators had nothing. For law enforcement, the challenge was steep. In 1993, without cell phone data, surveillance cameras on every corner, or advanced DNA processing, a case like Mandy's hinged on witnesses and physical evidence that could be easily missed. Detectives were forced to weigh their options carefully, treat the case as a runaway, a voluntary disappearance, or assume foul play from the start. This is where the tragedy of hindsight stings the most. Missing person cases are incredibly time-sensitive. Decisions in the first 48 hours can decide whether a case is solved quickly or drags on for decades. Looking back, what do you think investigators should prioritize when a teenager disappears under circumstances like Mandy's? Should they begin immediately under the assumption that foul play is likely, or should they give equal weight to all possibilities? For Mandy's family, there was never a question. She hadn't chosen to vanish. They knew her routines, her character, her relationships, and none of them pointed to a runaway scenario. Something terrible had happened. But knowing and proving are two very different things. As September rolled into October, the reality became harder to deny. Vigils were held in Mandy's name, with candles flickering against the cool night air. Her classmates at North Tonawanda High School wore ribbons and spoke about her in classrooms and hallways. The hallways she once walked now carried her absence like a shadow. Then, more than a month after she vanished, the long search reached a devastating end. On October 25, 1993, in Lewiston, New York, about 20 miles from where Mandy was last seen, A group of teenagers exploring Bond Lake Park stumbled onto something they would never forget. The park, usually alive with families walking trails or children playing near the water, had turned into the setting of a nightmare. In a wooded area, off the beaten paths, the teens found what appeared at first to be discarded clothing. But as they moved closer, they realized the horrifying truth: a human body partially decomposed. Panic and disbelief swept through them. Authorities were called immediately. When police arrived, they secured the area, marking off the wooded patch with yellow tape. Soon, investigators confirmed what the Steingasser family had feared for weeks. The remains belonged to Amanda Mandy Steingasser. The discovery shattered any lingering hope. The family's world collapsed in that single confirmation. Their daughter, who they had prayed might walk back through the front door at any moment, was gone forever. The medical examiner's findings painted a grim picture. Mandy had been strangled with her own bra, which was knotted tightly around her neck. She also suffered a skull fracture near her left ear, the result of blunt force trauma. The injuries left no doubt: this was a homicide. Based on the condition of her body, she had been left in the park for some time. News of the discovery reverberated across the region. For weeks, parents had whispered to each other in worried tones, watching their children more closely, pulling them inside earlier. Now those fears crystallized. A predator had taken one of their own. Bond Lake Park, once a peaceful recreational space, became a crime scene. Police combed the area for evidence: fibers, footprints, discarded belongings. But weeks of exposure to weather, animals, and human activity had stripped the site of most potential clues. Investigators still turned their focus back to the one name that had surfaced from the very beginning: Joseph Belstadt. He was re-interviewed, and his car, a 1984 Pontiac, was once again scrutinized. Vacuum samples were taken from the interior, searching for fibers and hairs. At the time, forensic tools were limited. DNA testing in the early 90s required far larger samples than today, and mitochondrial DNA analysis was still years away from common use. Any trace evidence collected was bagged and stored, but no answers emerged. This left detectives with a painful dilemma. Belstadt remained their strongest lead, but without solid forensic evidence, they couldn't tie him conclusively to Mandy's murder. Bringing charges too early risked a failed case that could never be retried. Waiting meant gambling that evidence could be preserved until technology caught up. If you were in their shoes, what would you have done? Would you take the risk of charging with a weaker case to try for immediate justice, or would you wait, knowing it might take years, even decades, for science to catch up? For the Steingasser family, the discovery of Mandy's body marked the beginning of another kind of torment. Grief consumed them, but it was accompanied by the gnawing absence of justice. They buried their daughter knowing her killer was still free. Her funeral was attended by classmates, friends, and neighbors, with mourners spilling out onto the church steps. Many clutched flowers or wore ribbons in her memory. Some wept openly, others stood in stunned silence, unable to process the cruelty of what had happened. North Tonawanda itself was transformed. The murder of a 17-year-old girl was not something that simply faded from memory. 4 years afterward, parents invoked Mandy's name when warning their children about safety. Her story circulated in schools, in whispers and cautionary tales, long after her case went cold. Meanwhile, police refused to let the case drop. They continued gathering information, quietly monitoring Joseph Belstadt, revisiting evidence and checking in on leads. But with no breakthrough, the case soon slipped into the category dreaded by every investigator and every family: a cold case. The search for Mandy was over, but the fight for justice was only just beginning. Detectives would now turn their full attention to piecing together her final hours, re-examining evidence, and pressing the one man who remained at the center of suspicion. Yet, without the tools of modern science, their path forward would be steep, frustrating, and at times heartbreakingly uncertain. Detectives now faced the grimmest task of all: transforming a devastating discovery into a solvable homicide case. Bond Lake Park had given them Mandy's body, but it had not yielded the kind of forensic evidence they desperately needed. Weeks of exposure to the elements had degraded much of what might have been present. Still, they pressed forward, determined to extract every possible lead. Their focus never strayed far from one name: Joseph Belstadt. He was the last person known to have been with Mandy. He admitted driving her the night she vanished, but he insisted he dropped her off at home. That simple statement became the fulcrum of the entire investigation. If true, someone else had encountered Mandy afterward. If false, then Bellstat was lying and he alone carried the secret of what happened. Investigators brought him in for questioning, pressing him to account for every detail of the night of September 19, 1993. His story remained consistent. He claimed he left Mandy outside her home and drove away. But detectives were troubled by inconsistencies. Mandy's parents insisted she never made it inside. No neighbors recalled seeing her. And no physical evidence supported his version of events. Suspicion grew heavier with each unanswered question. Still, suspicion alone was not enough to build a case. In the courtroom, prosecutors needed evidence, hard, physical proof that would survive the scrutiny of defense attorneys and jurors. At the time, forensic science could not provide it. DNA technology was still in its infancy. Matching fibers or hairs from Bellstat's car to Mandy would not carry the same weight in 1993 that it might decades later. To strengthen their case, investigators seized Bellstat's 1984 Pontiac. Forensic teams vacuumed every inch of the vehicle, collecting fibers, hairs, and other trace materials. These samples were bagged, cataloged, and sent to the lab. The hope was simple. Somewhere inside that car there had to be evidence linking Mandy to her final ride. But when the results came back, the findings were inconclusive. Some fibers and hairs were recovered, but the technology available then could not identify them beyond broad characteristics. They could not say with certainty that they belonged to Mandy. For investigators, it was like holding puzzle pieces without a way to see the picture they belonged to. The disappointment was crushing. The strongest physical lead had fizzled. Bellstat was still their primary suspect, but without definitive forensic results, the case teetered on shaky ground. Charging him now risked an acquittal, and if that happened, double jeopardy laws meant he could never be tried again no matter what evidence surfaced later. This forced detectives into a difficult choice: act now with what they had or wait in the hope that new technology would one day give them the answers they needed. If you were the lead investigator, what would you have done? Would you gamble on the chance of immediate justice, or would you hold back, knowing it might take decades before the science could catch up? As weeks turned into months, detectives continued working the case. They re-interviewed Mandy's friends, hoping someone had heard a detail or seen something the night she vanished. They retraced routes, asking whether anyone had spotted Bellstat's car near Bond Lake Park. They canvassed the neighborhoods, searching for witnesses who might have overlooked something in the early days. They even returned to Bond Lake multiple times, hoping to find overlooked evidence in the wooded terrain. But nature had already done its damage. Leaves had fallen, rain had washed away potential footprints, and the passage of time had erased traces that might have once been there. Still, detectives preserved what they had. The vacuumed fibers and hairs from Bellstat's car were sealed and stored carefully, marked for potential retesting in the future. Even then, some investigators sensed that forensic science was on the verge of breakthroughs. They hoped that what was inconclusive in 1993 might one day become undeniable proof. Meanwhile, the Steingasser family endured their own unrelenting nightmare. The hope of finding Mandy alive was gone, but now so was the hope of swift justice. At North Tonawanda High School, her absence lingered in the halls. An empty desk. A face missing from the yearbook. Teachers who had to watch as her classmates graduated while her name was never called. For her parents, holidays became a reminder of what was missing. A chair at the table that would never be filled again. They pressed for answers in every way they could, attending community events, speaking at vigils, and reminding the public that Mandy's case was not forgotten. But as the years passed, the media coverage faded. The candlelight vigils grew smaller. The world moved forward, but the Steingassers remained frozen in grief. For families of homicide victims, this is the cruelest stage. The initial outpouring of support begins to fade. News coverage tapers off. Friends and neighbors, though well-meaning, return to their daily routines. But for the family, nothing has changed. Their loved one is still gone. Their killer is still free. This raises another difficult question. How should communities support families in cases like this? When the headlines fade and the investigation grows cold, what can be done to make sure the victims and their loved ones are not forgotten? Share your thoughts, because too often families like the Steingassers are left to grieve in silence, long after the world has moved on. For investigators, the case file became a haunting weight in the years that followed. Each anniversary of Mandy's death was a reminder of unfinished work. The fibers collected from Belstat's car, the vacuumed samples, the crime scene photos, all remained preserved but unanswered. Detectives could only hope that one day science would evolve enough to unlock their secrets. And so, through the mid-1990s and into the 2000s, the murder of Mandy Steingasser remained one of Western New York's most haunting unsolved cases. A teenage girl had been brutally murdered, her body left in a park, and the man suspected of killing her walked free. The frustration was immense. The grief was permanent. And the wait stretched into years when it seemed Mandy's case might never see justice. But in the end, it would be those very fibers and hairs, sealed in evidence bags and stored away for decades, that would become the key. Time had not destroyed them. Time had preserved them, waiting for the science of the future to catch up with the crime of the past. For the Steingasser family, time became both an enemy and a cruel reminder of all that had been stolen. Each September brought back painful anniversaries: the night Mandy disappeared, the day her body was discovered, the birthdays she would never celebrate. While her friends grew older, finished school, started families, and moved on with their lives, Mandy remained forever 16 in photographs framed on her parents' walls. Detectives, too, felt the weight of time pressing down. The file on Mandy Steingasser grew thick with notes, interviews, and lab reports, yet remained incomplete without the one thing that mattered most: justice. 4 years, her case sat in limbo, categorized as an open homicide but with little forward motion. Evidence had been collected, leads had been followed, and yet none of it was enough to bring charges. The suspicion surrounding Joseph Belstat never faded. He was still the last person known to have been with Mandy, and investigators remained convinced he was responsible. But in the absence of ironclad proof, he lived his life in North Tonawanda, working, driving the same car, and appearing at community events, a free man. For Mandy's family, seeing him continue with his life while theirs had been shattered was almost unbearable. Years rolled into decades. The 1990s came and went. The early 2000s brought new technologies, but funding and prioritization often meant cold cases like Mandy's remained low on the list. Still, advances in forensic science were being made quietly in labs across the country. DNA testing, which had been rudimentary in the early 1990s, grew more sophisticated with every passing year. By the mid-2000s, short tandem repeat, STR, testing allowed scientists to identify individuals with far greater accuracy than ever before. Later still, new techniques could extract usable DNA from evidence once thought too degraded to analyze. For detectives still haunted by Mandy's case, these scientific breakthroughs represented hope. The evidence sealed away in storage, the fibers and hairs vacuumed from Belstat's Pontiac, the items collected from the recovery site, had never truly been silent. They had simply been waiting for the right technology to give them a voice. It was a waiting game, but it was one investigators were willing to play. They knew if they rushed, if they filed charges too soon without sufficient evidence, Belstat could walk free forever. Instead, they bided their time, carefully preserving every scrap of evidence and monitoring the progress of forensic science. By the early 2010s, renewed interest in cold cases swept across the nation. Police departments began re-examining long-dormant files, encouraged by advances in DNA testing. In New York, similar momentum built, and detectives revisited cases like Mandy's, asking the question that had lingered for nearly 2 decades: could science finally deliver what had once been impossible? For the Steingasser family, every phone call from law enforcement carried a mix of dread and hope. They had endured countless disappointments before. Was this call going to bring them closure, or another reminder of how far they still had to go? Imagine living for over 20 years with your child's case unsolved. Would you still cling to hope, or would you find yourself slowly giving up? It's a haunting question many families of cold case victims face. Detectives decided it was time to revisit the evidence from Belstat's car. Modern DNA analysis offered new potential. Samples that had yielded nothing in the 1990s could now be retested with greater precision. Scientists set to work on the vacuum sweepings, the tiny fibers and hairs collected from the interior of the Pontiac all those years ago. This time results emerged. Technicians identified a hair strand containing DNA. When compared against Mandy's genetic profile, the conclusion was clear: the hair belonged to her. It had been found in Belstat's vehicle years after he claimed he had dropped her off at home. that single strand directly contradicted his story. He had insisted Mandy was never in his car after that night. The evidence now told a different story. She had been in his car much longer than he admitted, possibly on the night she was murdered. The breakthrough electrified the investigation. After nearly 25 years of frustration, detectives finally had something solid, something undeniable. DNA had spoken where witnesses could not. It was the scientific link tying Mandy to Belstadt, and it gave prosecutors what they had lacked all along: physical evidence strong enough to convince a jury. Yet, as monumental as this discovery was, investigators knew they had to move carefully. Cold cases are delicate, and any misstep could undermine the entire prosecution. Detectives began re-examining every angle of the case, reconstructing timelines, reviewing prior interviews, and ensuring there were no gaps the defense could exploit. They also reached out to the Steingasser family, informing them of the new developments. For Mandy's parents, it was a bittersweet moment. At last, a crack had formed in the wall of silence that had surrounded their daughter's murder for so long. But with it came painful memories dragged back into the present. The wound that had never truly healed was torn open again. The community, too, reacted with renewed interest. After so many years, Mandy's case had become a symbol of unresolved grief in Western New York. News of a potential breakthrough reignited public attention. Local media revisited the story, neighbors once again discussed the tragedy, and many asked whether justice, delayed though it was, might finally be within reach. And yet, even with the new DNA evidence, the question of prosecution remained. Was one strand of hair enough to convict a man of murder after so much time had passed? Would jurors believe the science, or would they see the decades-long gap as a weakness in the case? This dilemma highlights something larger. In cold cases, the passage of time is both a curse and a weapon. Evidence degrades, witnesses forget, and memories fade. But the evolution of science can transform even the smallest piece of evidence into a decisive clue. Do you believe advances in DNA technology have been the single most important factor in solving cold cases? Or is it the persistence of investigators who refuse to give up? For Mandy's case, it would take both unrelenting detectives and the science of the future to move the investigation forward. And by 2018, investigators felt confident enough to act. After nearly a quarter-century of waiting, they were ready to bring Joseph Belstadt to trial. The transition was seismic. For the Steingasser family, it meant that justice, long deferred, was finally possible. For Belstadt, it meant the walls of suspicion that had surrounded him for decades were now closing in. The community that had lived with unanswered questions since 1993 was about to witness a courtroom drama that would revisit the night Mandy disappeared and the years of pain that followed. And so, with a single strand of hair as their weapon, prosecutors prepared to face the man they believed had stolen Mandy's future. The trial was about to begin, and with it, the chance to finally answer the question that had haunted North Tonawanda for 25 years. What really happened to Amanda Mandy Steingasser? For 25 years, Mandy's case had sat on a shelf, carried in the hearts of her family and the memories of her community. Then in March of 2018, the silence broke. Police announced that Joseph Belstadt, now in his mid-40s, was arrested and charged with second-degree murder in the 1993 death of Amanda Mandy Steingasser. The news rippled instantly through North Tonawanda, Wheatfield, and beyond. After decades of whispers and suspicion, an official charge was finally made. The moment was surreal for Mandy's family. Her parents had waited half their lives for justice, and though grief never faded, this was the first sign that justice might finally arrive. For neighbors and classmates who remembered Mandy as a teenager, as the smiling 16-year-old who had vanished without a trace, the arrest reopened wounds. But it also rekindled hope. When the trial began in 2019, the courtroom in Niagara County was filled nearly every day. Family members sat shoulder to shoulder, sometimes clutching photos of Mandy, sometimes just holding one another's hands. Reporters lined the benches, sketch artists capturing the faces of the accused and the grieving family. At the defense table sat Joseph Belstadt, older, heavier, but unmistakably the same man police had questioned back in 1993. The prosecution opened by reminding the jury of who Mandy was: a teenager with dreams, a family that adored her, and a life brutally cut short. Then they carefully laid out what they believed happened. Belstadt offered her a ride home, but she never made it. Days later, her body was discovered near Bond Lake. The prosecutor emphasized the decades-long wait, stressing that science had finally given Mandy her voice back. The defense countered with a familiar refrain. The evidence was old, the memories of witnesses faded, the DNA partial, not a full match. They argued that the case was too weak to rely on, that doubt was more than reasonable. And above all, they insisted that Bellstadt should not be convicted on science alone. Detectives who had worked the original case testified, some now gray-haired, recalling the frustration of 1993. They told the jury about Bellstadt's suspicious behavior, the vacuuming of his car, and the years of inconclusive results. Their voices carried not only professional duty but also the personal weight of a case that had haunted them. Then came the forensic experts. Using language the jury could understand, they explained how DNA extracted from evidence in the 1990s could now be reanalyzed with far greater sensitivity. They described the exact process, revisiting the preserved samples, applying modern techniques, and finding that the DNA linked directly to Bellstadt with a statistical certainty that could not be ignored. One expert emphasized that while the DNA profile was partial, the probability of it belonging to someone else was astronomically small. Numbers that resonated with the jury. Another described how meticulous evidence preservation back in 1993 had made this possible, crediting the investigators who had the foresight to seal and store the materials properly. The courtroom was tense during this testimony. Jurors leaned forward, listening intently as science spoke across decades. Mandy's parents, watching quietly, clutched tissues as they heard confirmation that their daughter's case had never truly been forgotten. Every so often, eyes turned toward Bellstadt. He sat mostly still, sometimes shaking his head, sometimes scribbling notes. Jurors glanced between him and the evidence, studying him as they weighed the prosecution's case. For them, it was a difficult balance, trusting science that spanned a quarter century, while also questioning whether circumstantial evidence filled in the gaps. Local media described the courtroom as heavy with silence at times, broken only by the deliberate words of experts and attorneys. Outside, television vans and reporters crowded the courthouse steps, filing daily updates that reminded the public just how important this trial was. Mandy's case had become not only a fight for one family's justice but also a test of how modern forensics could deliver answers long overdue. In closing, the prosecution told the jury, "Science has caught up to the truth. It has taken decades, but we now know who was responsible." They walked jurors once more through the timeline, the car ride, the body at Bond Lake, and the DNA results. The defense urged them to resist what they framed as an emotional appeal. "You cannot convict on feelings," the defense attorney argued. "You must convict only on evidence. And this evidence, ladies and gentlemen, is not enough." When the jury retired to deliberate, hours felt like days. Mandy's family waited, knowing that the outcome could either finally bring closure or reopen the wound once more. After several hours, the jury returned. The room hushed as the foreperson stood. The words came clear: guilty of second-degree murder. Gasps, tears, and quiet sobs filled the courtroom. Mandy's family held each other tightly, emotions pouring out after 26 years of uncertainty. Bellstadt showed little visible reaction, though his shoulders slumped as the weight of the decision settled over him. Reporters captured the moment, the contrast between a family's tears of bittersweet relief and a man's silent reckoning with justice finally served. At sentencing, the judge did not mince words. He spoke of the cruelty of taking a young girl's life and leaving her family to suffer for decades. He acknowledged the long wait for justice and the role science played in delivering it. Then he handed down the maximum, 25 years to life in prison. Before the sentence was read, Mandy's parents addressed the court. They spoke of birthdays and holidays missed, of her empty chair at family gatherings, of the milestones she never reached. Their voices broke, but their words were steady. "We have waited for this moment for more than half our lives," one said. "Today at least we know Mandy's story was heard." The judge, moved by their resilience, reminded the courtroom that justice, though delayed, had finally been delivered. Outside, reporters relayed the verdict to the world. Headlines declared, "After 26 years, justice for Mandy Steingasser." Community members left flowers at Bond Lake, some remembering the weeks in 1993 when search parties combed those woods. Former classmates described feeling both sorrow and relief. Local commentators wrote about how this case symbolized the power of never giving up, how persistence in science could rewrite even the coldest of stories. Mandy's case became part of a larger national story. Across the country, cold cases were being solved through the application of advanced DNA analysis and genetic genealogy. The Steingasser case stood among them, showing how justice could reach across time, no matter how many years had passed. It underscored an important truth: every piece of evidence matters and every victim deserves a voice. At this stage, viewers were left to grapple with profound questions. Do you believe science alone should be enough to convict someone in a decades-old murder case, or should it always require additional evidence? And when justice is delayed for so many years, can it ever truly heal the wounds of those left behind? For Mandy's family, the conviction was not an end, but a step forward. Justice had come, but the loss remained. As the gavel fell and Bellstadt was led away, the question shifted: what does justice mean when it arrives so late? And what legacy does Mandy's case leave for her family, her community, and for the pursuit of justice in cold cases everywhere? For Mandy's family, the conviction of Joseph Bellstadt brought a sense of justice, but it was never going to erase the pain of losing their daughter. They had carried her memory through more than 2 decades of waiting, through birthdays and anniversaries, through vigils and prayers. And now, while a verdict had been delivered and a sentence imposed, the hole left behind by Mandy's absence could never be filled. Reporters who covered the trial often reflected on the remarkable resilience of her parents and siblings. They had remained steadfast for years, appearing at press conferences, meeting with investigators, and refusing to let Mandy's story fade into silence. Even when leads dried up, they continued to speak her name publicly. That persistence meant that when technology finally advanced, there was still a case to pursue, still a voice demanding answers. Mandy's family showed the kind of courage that turns tragedy into advocacy, not because they wanted to, but because they had to. The community, too, carried Mandy in memory. Bond Lake, once the scene of despair in September 1993, later became a place of reflection. People left flowers, lit candles, and paused by the water to remember the girl who had been taken too soon. Teachers and classmates spoke of her smile and her laughter, the ordinary moments of youth that lingered in their minds decades later. Even those who never met her came to feel the weight of her story. Her disappearance and murder had become part of the fabric of local history, a wound that shaped the community, and a story parents would quietly retell to remind their children to be careful. When the verdict was read in 2019, local media didn't just report on the conviction. They framed it as a closing of one of Western New York's longest, most painful chapters. Commentators described it as a victory for justice and for science. After 26 years, Mandy Steingasser finally has her day in court, one newspaper wrote. Another editorial reflected, it may have taken decades, but silence did not win. The truth survived. Across the country, Mandy's case resonated within a much larger story. The late 2010s saw a wave of long unsolved cases revived by advances in forensic science. In California, the Golden State Killer case was solved through genetic genealogy. In other states, names long forgotten were matched to DNA evidence, bringing closure to families who had waited just as long as Mandy's. Her case became a local example of that national trend, a reminder that even when decades pass, the possibility of justice remains alive as long as evidence is preserved and science keeps advancing. Law enforcement officers who had followed Mandy's case spoke openly about the importance of preservation. If those original investigators hadn't vacuumed Bellstadt's car, if they hadn't carefully logged every item, if they hadn't had the foresight to seal and store what seemed like inconclusive fibers, there would have been nothing to test in 2018. This became a teaching point for police departments everywhere. No case should ever be considered hopeless. What cannot be solved today may well be solved tomorrow. The Steingasser case became proof that time is not always the enemy of justice. Sometimes, it is an ally of truth. Yet justice, delayed as it was, came with complexities. Mandy's parents spoke openly about their gratitude for the conviction, but also about the years stolen from them. Birthdays that passed in silence. Christmas mornings where her absence felt unbearable. Weddings and family milestones where her seat remained empty. One of the hardest truths they voiced was that justice could not give back the years of not knowing. The verdict provided answers, but it did not bring her back. "We're thankful," her mother said quietly to reporters after sentencing, "but we will always wonder who she would have been." That reflection echoed deeply in the community. Mandy would have been in her 40s at the time of the trial. Friends imagined what her life might have looked like. A career, perhaps children of her own, a life fully lived. Instead, she was frozen in memory at 16. This is the cruel reality of cold cases solved decades later. The answers come, but the possibilities of a future never return. Her case also inspired other families of missing and murdered loved ones to keep pressing. Advocates in New York pointed to the Steingasser conviction as proof that waiting did not mean forgetting. Some families who had long lost hope returned to police departments asking whether their cases could be revisited with the same kind of modern testing. In this way, Mandy's voice extended beyond her own story. She became a symbol of why it matters to never stop asking questions, never stop demanding answers, and never stop believing that even the oldest evidence can tell the truth. For police and prosecutors, the case was also a reminder of patience. Detectives admitted that in the 1990s they had suspected Bellstat but simply didn't have the science to prove it. Rushing charges then might have risked an acquittal. Waiting meant decades of pain for the family, but it also meant that when science caught up, justice could not be denied. This raises a question we must all consider. Would you rather see a suspect charged quickly with weaker evidence, or wait years until science can remove nearly all doubt? At the same time, the community reflected on what justice really means in such circumstances. Does a conviction decades later bring closure, or is closure simply an idea we attach to survival? Can justice delivered so late ever feel whole? These are questions that linger not just in Mandy's case, but in every cold case. Families find their own answers, but for many, closure is less about an ending and more about carrying grief differently. As years passed after the trial, the name Mandy Steingasser remained etched in the local consciousness. Memorial events were held, not to reopen old wounds but to honor her life. Teachers who had once known her spoke at gatherings. Former classmates, now grown adults with families of their own, shared their memories. For them, remembering Mandy was not only about the loss but also about the joy she had brought in the short time she was here. The case also continues to influence how people think about safety, evidence, and advocacy. In lectures and training sessions, law enforcement officials still mention the Steingasser investigation as an example of persistence paying off. Forensic science classes in New York colleges point to it as a case study in how technology changes the landscape of criminal justice. Each retelling ensures that Mandy's story is not forgotten, but rather becomes part of the learning that protects future generations. And for those who hear her story now, perhaps for the first time, it serves as a reminder that every victim is more than a case file. Mandy was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She had dreams and laughter, a future that deserved to unfold. Her life matters, her story matters, and her justice matters. As we reflect on this journey, we are left with questions that go beyond the courtroom. What does it mean for a community to carry a case for so long? How do families survive in the absence of answers? And what role do we all play in keeping stories alive until justice is finally found? What remains undeniable is that Mandy Steingasser's voice was finally heard. It took 26 years, but her story did not fade into silence. It stands now as a reminder that truth can endure, even across decades, and that justice, though delayed, can still be found. And as we close this chapter, we thank you for walking through this journey with us here at the Cold Case Archive. If you found Mandy's story as powerful and important as we did, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss when we uncover the next case. Most importantly, share your thoughts in the comments below, because every voice helps keep these stories alive, and every conversation keeps the memory of victims like Mandy burning bright.